They were found 27 kilometers from the nearest paved road. No birth certificates, no school records, just 3 pale children, all with the same piercing blue eyes. And no documented mother. Welcome to Gothic Ledger, where forgotten records speak louder than confession. If you find yourself drawn to stories buried in archives, sealed by silence, or erased by time, consider subscribing. It helps us continue the search for what was left out of history books. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We're curious who else keeps strange hours. This case begins in March of 1982 in a remote corner of Missouri's Ozark Mountains. A social worker followed a dirt path into the forest, responding to a vague report of neglected children. What she found wasn't just a family hidden from society, it was a bloodline sealed off from the world for generations. The man who greeted her identified himself as Elijah Shelton. He lived with his sister Martha and 3 children. But as she observed their faces, something shifted in her understanding. The eyes, the jawlines, the way the youngest boy clung to the woman, not like an aunt, but a mother. And not just resemblance, repetition. The children didn't just look like their guardians, they mirrored them. There were no records of a wife, no record of any birth, and the woman by the window never spoke a word. In the days that followed, officials uncovered something that had gone unnoticed for decades, perhaps willfully. A house fire in 1973, a withdrawn deed to a forgotten cabin, whispered warnings from neighbors who were never believed. And then, the truth. Elijah Shelton had 3 children with his own sister. This is not a story of a single crime. It is a study of erosion, of how belief can rot into conviction, and how blood, when isolated too long, begins to echo. In this investigation, we'll follow the collapse of a forgotten household in the Ozarks. We'll trace the lineage of secrecy, the failure of institutions, and the quiet horror that builds when no one looks long enough to see. What happens when a family closes the door and never opens it again? Let's begin. No neighbors, no birth certificates, only blue-eyed children in the woods. On March 17, 1982, after a thawing winter had softened the hill roads to ruts and sludge, a government vehicle climbed into the folds of the Missouri backwoods. Margaret Wilson, a junior social worker assigned to child welfare assessments, had been dispatched to investigate an anonymous complaint. A brief note, unsigned, reporting that something's wrong with the children up in Dell. The map was no help. Past a certain point, there were no road names, only directions tied to fading landmarks. The hollowed barn, the cedar grove, the well that never ran dry. 30 kilometers from the nearest post office, the vehicle reached its end at a narrowing path of mud and pine needles, hemmed by silence and the looming silhouettes of skeletal trees. Beyond that, Margaret walked. The Shelton property did not appear so much as emerge. A structure of gray timber, slouched beneath its own age, stood at the edge of a clearing long reclaimed by undergrowth. The boards were soft with moisture. Its windows were covered from the inside with patchwork quilts. Smoke rose in thin, reluctant threads from a single chimney. There was no fence, no mailbox, and no vehicle in sight. She was greeted at the threshold by a man later confirmed to be 47, though his face bore the sallow erosion of a much older life. His eyes, an unsettling glacier blue, never left hers. He introduced himself only as Elijah. Behind him stood a woman of similar age, silent, hair pulled tightly back, her gaze fixed on the children clustered by the hearth. There were 3 of them, a boy of 12 with a long scar across one forearm, a girl, perhaps 9, whose left eye drifted faintly toward her nose, and the youngest, barely 5, thin as a reed and unblinking, stood half-hidden behind the woman's skirt, gripping its fabric with pale fingers. All 3 possessed the same icy eyes, the same angular cheekbones, the same curious indent just above the ear. The cabin had no electricity. Its water came from a well some 50 yards out. Shelves held jars of pickled vegetables, cans with faded labels, and dried herbs bundled in string. There were no books, no photographs, no clocks. Margaret made careful notes: mild malnutrition, scar tissue from an improperly treated wound, visual impairment, developmental delay. What troubled her most, however, was not what she observed, but what she did not. There were no signs of another adult, no evidence of a mother, no official documents, no birth certificates, no school records, no medical history. When asked directly, the man claimed his wife had died in childbirth. He did not elaborate. The woman, standing silently, did not correct him. Later she would recall the way the children sat, not as siblings accustomed to play, but as pieces from the same mold, observing her with unnerving synchronization. They did not speak, not a word. She stayed for 40 minutes, then she walked back down the road, boots heavy with mud, head heavy with something else she would not name for several more days. That night, in her report, Margaret noted a final observation. The children are not only alike in features, they are alike in posture, in breath, in silence. It is not resemblance, it is replication. She did not sleep. He said his wife died in childbirth. There is no record she ever existed. In the weeks following the initial welfare visit, attempts were made to verify the family's history through official channels. What began as a routine inquiry, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, soon gave way to something else. Absence. Not the bureaucratic kind, but something colder. A silence curated over years, deliberate and absolute. There was no documentation of a woman tied to Elijah by marriage, residence, or burial. No obituary in any regional paper. No medical record of complications during childbirth, nor evidence of a midwife called to the cabin. The nearest county clerk's office held no file under the family name beyond a deed, handwritten and barely legible, transferring property rights in 1924 to a Harold Shelton and his wife Edith. Their children were listed on a school registry from 1951, Elijah and Martha, both withdrawn just 3 years later. Since then, the paper trail ends. The youngest child, Jacob, was said to be 5. There is no record of his birth, nor for the others. Hospital staff in nearby towns reported no deliveries under the Shelton name, no home visits, no vaccinations, no injuries formally logged. The children, from a legal standpoint, had never been born. They simply were. During her second visit to the cabin, Margaret inquired again. The man repeated that his wife had died. This time he said it without any visible grief, as though reciting a borrowed line. When asked where she had been buried, he only gestured vaguely toward the edge of the woods. The woman, his sister, as later confirmed, stood by the window, eyes fixed on the forest. She did not correct him. Investigators noted this silence more than once. The woman, always present, always silent. When the children grew restless, she calmed them with a glance. When they fought, they did not cry out for her, but they still watched her hands for instruction. A witness remarked how naturally she navigated the home, preparing food, gathering herbs, tending to injuries, while Elijah remained curiously detached from these duties. Anomalies multiplied. The boy with the scar had a distinct lilt to his movements, favoring his right side. When asked, the woman had stepped forward, instinctively describing, without hesitation, the exact nature of the injury, its date, and the herbs used to treat it. Elijah, by contrast, had simply shrugged. Further requests for documentation were met with silence. A court clerk searching back through regional census entries discovered something peculiar. In the 1960 record, the household listed Harold, Edith, Elijah, and Martha. No other individuals were recorded on the property since. One archivist later noted that, in rural cases, it was not uncommon for records to fade or be misfiled. But in this instance, the absence was not passive. It was as if someone had pulled up each root carefully and buried it in the same soil the children now played in. That winter, a state official quietly marked the Shelton file with an unusual note. No maternal identity identified. Possible fabrication of spousal history. Consider alternative kinship structure. But no action followed. Snowfall soon cut off the road again, and for a time the file sat untouched, while the children continued to grow, their faces aligning more perfectly each season. No birth, no death, no woman at all, and yet every child's gaze mirrored her eyes. He said the outside world couldn't be trusted. Only blood could. 1 week after the initial visit, the state returned to the Shelton cabin. This time with reinforcement. The accompanying party included a sheriff's deputy from Shannon County and a pediatrician familiar with rural child welfare cases. They arrived in the early morning, their tires groaning against the frost-hardened track, mud stiff beneath patches of lingering snow. The cabin's chimney was smoking again. Someone had been up for hours. No welcome was offered. Elijah met them at the door with folded arms and narrowed eyes, posture rigid as if bracing for impact. When informed of the need for medical assessment, he reportedly muttered the same phrase 3 times, each slower than the last. "We take care of ours." The pediatrician was granted only limited access, and only inside the main room of the cabin. No bedrooms were shown, no records were provided. The woman, who had previously remained silent, appeared again by the hearth. The children, unchanged in expression or energy, were seated cross-legged on the floor, each with a woven mat and a wooden toy of unknown origin. They did not look up. The physical examinations were conducted in silence. The eldest boy had an extra digit on his left hand, fully formed, with nail and knuckle, a rare condition but not unheard of. The girl's vision issue, already noted by Margaret, was confirmed as untreated strabismus. The youngest, Jacob, presented more troubling signs: flattened affect, delayed speech, poor coordination. His drawings, made at the pediatrician's request, were uniform grids of shapes repeated obsessively, each one in thick, dark pencil. The paper tore in places from pressure. None of the children spoke during the visit. When touched, they flinched, more from unfamiliarity than pain. When called by name, they responded only with movement, not voice. What concerned the physician most was not any single condition but the confluence of traits, neurological delays, skeletal anomalies, ophthalmic irregularities, all within a single family unit. He would later describe it as a mosaic of inherited fragments, as if nature had been working from a limited set of materials. The sheriff attempted to interview the adults separately. Elijah refused. He stood between the investigator and his sister throughout the questioning, his answers flat, controlled, and circular. He cited privacy, he cited self-reliance, he cited God. The phrase returned again and again. We take care of ours, as if it were not just a belief, but a directive passed down, unquestioned. The team stayed less than an hour. Later, in a private note shared among officials, the pediatrician wrote that the family reminded him of an enclosed system, like a pond that had not been stirred in years. The air inside the cabin had a stillness that felt deliberate, cultivated, a kind of internal weather, sealed from the outside. No immediate action was taken. There was concern, but not yet justification. The law, it was said, required something more than discomfort. It required proof, and so they left. The frost had melted by noon, and the tracks they'd made were already fading in the mud behind them. The cabin door closed. Inside, the children returned to their seats. According to the physician, the youngest was seen mouthing something soundlessly as they walked away, lips forming silent syllables. It might have been mimicry, or it might have been a name. No one could tell whose. After the fire, they cut all ties, but something else began to burn. The Shelton house fire occurred in the early hours of October 3, 1973. No official cause was determined. A chimney left to crack, or perhaps a lantern left lit, no one could say with certainty. What remained was a foundation of scorched stone and two bodies, partially consumed, presumed to be Harold and Edith Shelton, the last known adults associated with the land. In the weeks that followed, Elijah and Martha were seen briefly in town, handling the final transactions, collecting a death certificate, signing a single document confirming property transfer. Then, quietly and without notice, they disappeared into the hills. The cabin had already been built by then, not a replacement for the family home, but something older, rougher, originally erected by a grandfather whose name no records preserved. Situated deeper in the timberline, it was smaller, windowless on one side, and sealed with nails too long for modern use. Locals believed it had been abandoned, but within weeks of the fire, smoke was seen rising again from its chimney. After that, the Sheltons ceased all contact. Supplies were no longer collected from the general store. Letters were never sent. Church records listed them as absent, then eventually stopped listing them at all. Hunters who passed too close spoke of seeing movement at the tree line, followed by long, unnatural stillness. One of the few who claimed a sustained connection was a woman named Sarah Jenkins. Elderly by the 1970s, she had known Edith in her youth and believed it her duty to maintain some link, however faint. She recalled visiting the property once in the spring of 1971, 2 years before the fire. At that time, Harold was said to have been bedridden, and Edith had taken to speaking in riddles. But what stood out most, Sarah claimed, was the appearance of Martha. She was shown as visibly pregnant. The girl, still in her early 30s then, had emerged from behind the house with a bundle of wet laundry and a noticeable weight beneath her apron. Sarah recalled offering help, suggesting a doctor from town, but her concern was met with coldness. Elijah had appeared moments later and asked her, flatly, not to return. She didn't. When asked years later why she hadn't pressed further, she spoke only of a kind of quietness that didn't feel natural. Something in their eyes, she said, didn't match their words, a calmness that felt imposed. as though everything spoken inside that cabin was rehearsed from a single page. Sarah's memories grew disjointed with time, but one detail she repeated, even in her final interviews, was the way Martha held her stomach, not with anxiety nor pain, but with both hands flat, protective, possessive. There was no record of a birth, no midwife reported the visit, no cries were ever heard through the woods, but by the following winter, a child was seen peering through the cabin window. It was not clear which of them he resembled, only that his eyes were blue, and that when Sarah waved, he did not wave back. 3 witnesses, 3 warnings. None were followed. In the winter of 1969, a traveling preacher passed through the far reaches of Shannon County, part of a seasonal route that wound through sparsely charted communities in the Ozark interior. Reverend Samuel Miller had long kept personal ledgers of his visits, not as sermons, but as quiet observations. He had made note of the Shelton homestead that year, not for its piety, but for its silence. At the time, the main house still stood, half-rotted, wind-scoured, its chimney leaning like a neck bent in prayer. He described the inhabitants as wary. The man was said to have watched him from behind the woodpile, one hand resting on a rusted axe. The woman, when seen, seemed always to be standing just behind him, eyes lowered, her sleeves too long. It was not until his return visit in 1971 that Miller first reported concern. The larger home was now abandoned. The siblings had moved into the smaller structure, the cabin that stood deeper among the trees, once thought to be a tool shed or hunting shelter. It had no visible path, no windows on the northern wall, and no sign of children's play, and yet something about the space felt inhabited in ways the main house never had. He did not make it inside. Elijah, though not yet known by name, refused entry, but before the preacher turned back, he had glimpsed Martha again, briefly. This time she stood alone in the doorway. Her frame was swollen beneath a thick shawl, though it was too warm that day to need one. Her posture was different now, not bowed but rigid, as though any sudden movement might cause something to tear. He noted this in his journal and never returned. Years later, a clerk from the Current River General Store would recall brief sightings of the siblings during their rare visits for supplies. She described how they never entered together, always one outside, one inside, and how the children who accompanied them, though never introduced, shared faces that were too symmetrical, too recursive. She noticed the same curve to the jaw, the same strange depth in the eyes. A boy was once overheard asking if he could carry the flour. The tone was not defiant, but cautious, as if asking anything required careful calibration. She mentioned her concerns in passing to a constable, but no report was filed. By the time formal authorities took notice, the cabin was already its own ecosystem, one that spoke its own language, obeyed its own gravity. The witnesses, scattered, elderly, uncertain, offered memories clouded by time, distorted by fear of being wrong, or worse, being right. A final account emerged from a field medic, called once for an unrelated emergency further up the ridge. On his descent, he had passed the cabin, not knowing what it was. What caught his attention, he later claimed, was the stillness, unnatural for that stretch of forest. Even the crows had flown wide of it. What none of them saw, or would admit seeing, was what grew behind that stillness. Not rot, not ruin, but lineage, a self-contained lineage that needed nothing but itself to endure. The door had been there the whole time. No one knocked. He came in coughing. He left with answers buried in his blood. In September of 1982, after a series of visits that yielded little more than deflection and suspicion, the state found its first opening. The youngest child, Jacob, was seen by the social worker outside the cabin, pale and listless, his breath labored. When asked to speak, he did not answer. His mouth opened slightly, but only air passed through. It was this, more than any record or rumor, that allowed intervention. He was taken, with reluctant consent, to the West Plains Medical Facility. The journey down from the hills left streaks of mud across the ambulance floor, the boy wrapped in a woolen shawl that smelled faintly of smoke and mildew. At the hospital, the attending physician noted signs of advanced respiratory infection, with complications that suggested prolonged exposure to mold, untreated illness, or both. Initial blood work returned inconsistencies, low immunoglobulin levels, irregular bone density, traces of congenital anomalies unassociated with pneumonia. It was suggested that a genetic consult be performed given the known context of family isolation. Dr. Brennan, a clinical geneticist familiar with inbreeding markers, was brought in discreetly. The results did not surprise him. Jacob's genome displayed elevated homozygosity, genetic mirrors folding over one another, recessive traits aligned with rare precision. Brennan noted that the density of matched alleles was far beyond what is typically seen in first-cousin unions. It reflected something closer, a direct loop. The boy's facial features had gone unnoticed by many, perhaps because they did not disturb, only repeated. The wide-set eyes, the low nasal bridge, the slight dome of the cranium, mild but cumulative, hallmarks of a narrowed lineage. Brennan would later describe the face as a quiet echo of too few branches. During his hospital seance, Jacob barely spoke. Nurses reported him waking at night, eyes open but unfocused. On 2 occasions he was found sitting upright in bed, hands folded in perfect symmetry, staring at the corner of the room as though waiting for instruction. Martha stayed by his side for all but one night. She slept in the chair, refused meals, and declined all attempts at conversation. Her presence was not maternal in the conventional sense. It was older than that. Watchful, desperate, as if she herself were being unstitched by the sterile walls around her. On the 4th evening, when Jacob's fever broke and he finally slept, she was heard murmuring to herself. The attending nurse recalled her repeating a single phrase, one not addressed to anyone in particular. He said we would be safe. Nothing more. No name was given. No explanation followed. Though the pneumonia passed, Jacob remained under observation. His file thickened, tests were ordered, consultations held, discussions whispered in corners. For the first time, the questions were not pointed at Elijah or Martha. They were asked of the blood itself. That winter, Jacob was discharged to state custody, but not before one final note was added to his chart. It came from a pediatric neurologist who had briefly examined him. A small remark scribbled beside the cognitive assessment. When asked to draw his family, the boy included 5 figures, 4 with faces, 1 without. Not all chains are made of iron. Some are built from trust twisted over time. The slow unraveling began not with confession but with fatigue. After weeks by the hospital bed, after the child's fever waned and routine returned to the sterile rhythm of rounds and charting, something in Martha gave way, not loudly, not even clearly, but in fragments. Unthreaded thoughts passed quietly to the one person who stayed long enough to hear them. She never used his name. She spoke instead of a voice that grew louder after the fire, of a presence that filled the empty house when their parents were gone, of a certainty delivered in quiet tones that the world beyond the tree line could not be trusted. She said the newspapers lied, that schools taught filth, that strangers carried sickness in their breath. He had told her they were not like others, that their blood was older, purer, not broken by cities or wars or men in uniforms. Their family, he said, had been chosen to keep the line strong, to protect what had been passed down, that others would call it wrong, not because it was, but because they didn't understand. At first she resisted. In the early days she had spoken of leaving, of finding a teacher for the children, or at least a doctor, but every road was made to lead back. Her doubts, she said, were met with long silences, with doors left open in winter, with food left untouched until she agreed. Once, she had found the well covered with planks. No explanation, no repair. Just a warning, quiet and understood. What she believed changed slowly, she said, not in revelation, but in repetition, over years, not all at once. There were moments, blurred now by time, when she began to speak the same words he used, not just aloud, but in her thoughts. The children were not mistakes, they were chosen, a continuation, not a crime. She called them unspoiled. In the hospital, she asked D once if the staff would be sending them to school. When told they would, she paused, not with fear, not even disagreement, just surprise, as if the thought had not occurred to her that others might want to speak with the children. What she feared most, one nurse recalled, was not judgment, it was separation. She asked if the children would be allowed to stay together. She asked if they would still sleep in the same room. She asked if they would remember her when they were told not to. Later interviews with child psychologists would describe the case as one of identity erosion, a form of emotional reconditioning found in long-term captivity, but the language was insufficient. What happened in that cabin was not a single act, it was a structure, a belief system, a world built from one man's mouth and another's silence. Before she was discharged, Martha was asked whether she now believed the things she had once been told. She did not answer. Instead, she looked through the glass where Jacob slept and asked almost to herself if purity had a cost. Was it still purity at all? The question was not written down, but the nurse who heard it said she remembered the tone, not confusion, not regret, just wondering. In a courtroom barely lit, the Ozarks were finally put on record. The trial was held in early 1983 during a winter that arrived late but stayed longer than expected. The courthouse, constructed in 1907, had originally been designed for minor disputes, stolen livestock, broken boundaries, the occasional brawl between neighbors. It was not built for what was now seated before it. There were no cameras, no press benches, just creaking pews and a wood stove that clicked each time it cooled. The man at the center of it sat upright, eyes unfocused, hands folded on the table like a schoolboy awaiting instruction. His sister, seated 3 rows behind, was flanked by 2 state-appointed social workers. She never once looked at him. The charges were clear: incest, 3 counts, a Class D felony under Missouri law. But the facts that followed did not align cleanly with prosecution or defense. There were records, yes, DNA results, hospital assessments, missing documentation, but what emerged in testimony was something more difficult to weigh. Not the presence of guilt, but the erosion of context. A public defender argued that the man had been raised inside a closed system, that from birth he had been taught that outsiders could not be trusted, that his parents, also relatives, had shaped his world with superstition and severity. He had received no formal education, no church instruction, no visitors past the age of 10. The children he raised, the court was told, were not part of a scheme. They were part of a tradition, unspoken but inherited. Psychological experts were brought in to speak on the nature of isolation. One described the brain's tendency, under extreme conditions, to normalize even the most aberrant patterns. Another spoke of looped reality, a phenomenon observed in long-term confinement where time, roles, and identity begin to fold inward. The prosecution did not deny these conditions, but it maintained that the man had known enough to conceal them. He had lied to authorities, hidden the children's origins, created a false maternal identity. He had bartered in town with cash, avoided written contracts, and told the youngest never to speak when strangers appeared. The court, in the end, was not deciding whether a crime had occurred. That was already certain. What it struggled with was where the blame began. One moment was noted in particular by those in attendance. During the 3rd day, the sister was asked if she had ever said no, if at any point she had resisted what her brother had claimed was destiny. Her reply was hesitant, nearly inaudible. A court stenographer would later paraphrase it as a kind of forgetting, not of events, but of self, as if the idea of refusal had been misplaced over time, like a word in a language she no longer spoke. When the verdict came, it was guilty, with recommendation for leniency, 3 years. Eligible for release after 18 months, contingent upon supervision and treatment. The judge called it a necessary compromise between punishment and prevention. No one applauded, no one wept. The stove had gone cold, the room emptied slowly, quietly, as though the walls themselves wished to forget what they had finally heard. Their bodies were born from silence. Their futures would not be. After the trial, the children were placed under state protection, each relocated to a foster home in the neighboring county. The process was slow, methodical, tempered by years of neglect and the fragile constitution of bodies shaped by closeness too close, by bloodlines too narrow. For the first time, their lives were observed under fluorescent light and not candle smoke. Medical examinations were exhaustive, not rushed. Each child presented a separate constellation of complications, some obvious, others buried in their cells, revealed only through tests performed in distant labs. Geneticists described the findings as inevitable, the signatures of repeated endogamy, a family tree that doubled back upon itself until the roots tangled. The eldest, Thomas, bore the lightest imprint. His body had adapted. The extra digit, removed without complication, was little more than a remnant. He responded quickly to structured learning, his speech hesitant but clear, shaped by mimicry rather than instruction. Teachers noted a stillness in him, not disciplinary but watchful. He was often found standing silently at doorways, listening before entering. He asked few questions, but when he did, they were always about rules, boundaries, definitions. Sadie, the middle child, struggled with rhythm and proximity. Her hearing, slightly impaired, caused her to tilt her head unnaturally when spoken to, and her metabolism required regulation through medication. She resisted eye contact not out of fear, but as though the act itself made her too visible. During her first week in school, she was observed copying letters over and over, filling page after page with the same name, spelled differently each time. Jacob required the most care. Apert syndrome, identified during his hospitalization, necessitated multiple corrective surgeries. His skull structure was stabilized and his fused fingers partially separated. Cognitive development remained delayed, but he displayed a gentle temperament marked by tactile fixation. Blankets, curtains, walls, anything with texture held his attention for long stretches. When frightened, he did not cry. He simply covered his ears and hummed until silence returned. DNA testing confirmed what had already been whispered into court records. Elijah was the father, Martha the mother. The results were not contested. What followed was not healing in the expected sense. No child spoke openly of what had happened. No journal entries revealed sudden understanding. There was no catharsis. Instead, the process resembled excavation, years spent uncovering things planted too deeply to name. Therapists reported that each child responded to memory differently. Thomas forgot selectively. Sadie remembered sounds but not meanings. Jacob pointed to windows, even when indoors, and once, unprompted, drew a circle around a stick figure with no face. He tapped it 3 times before pushing the paper away. Some called it recovery, others called it reprogramming, but even after integration, schooling, medical treatment, and routine, the silence lingered, not around them but within. One psychologist, reflecting years later, described the siblings not as victims or survivors, but as relics, objects shaped by pressures so constant they no longer felt them. They lived, they adapted, but none of them ever said the word family without pausing first. It stood 27 kilometers from town, and the system never saw it. By the spring of 1990, the Shelton cabin had collapsed, not from flame or force but from rot, the slow kind carried in by seasons and silence. A forestry surveyor found it by accident while charting rainfall erosion in the upper Ozark basin. He noted it only in passing, a slumped outline of timber, half-sunken, overtaken by vines. No roof remained. The hearth had crumbled inward. A child's wooden toy, warped by rain, lay lodged in the roots of a sycamore that had grown where the front step once stood. No one came to rebuild. The land, once deeded without boundary, reverted to the state. There was no dispute, no heirs to contest it. The records had long since been archived, boxed and buried beneath newer scandals. But the story did not vanish. It circulated, first in legal circles, then academic, then through training manuals distributed to child welfare officers across the Midwest. By 1985, Missouri passed legislation mandating routine welfare checks for children in rural districts, regardless of reported complaints. It became known, unofficially, as the Shelton Clause. The impact stretched quietly outward. In Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, small towns reevaluated the assumptions that had kept them blind. That poverty explained all, that families, if unseen, were simply self-reliant, that blood did not turn inward. Martha remained under care for 2 years following the trial. Upon release, she relocated to the outskirts of West Plains, where the children, now in partial custody, were allowed to visit. She took courses, earned her GED, found work as an assistant in a local library where she was said to shelve books in absolute silence and return any misfiled volume with visible distress. She did not remarry. She did not move again. The children adapted, though unevenly. One pursued social work, another became a woodcarver known for pieces that lacked faces. The youngest, despite physical limitations, developed a modest public presence, speaking occasionally on rural disability access and the rights of children in non-traditional households. None of them kept the surname. The Shelton case is now studied in graduate programs and law seminars, less for its grotesque origins than for the system it exposed. A system not built on cruelty, but omission. The paperwork that never arrived, the visit that never occurred, the question that was almost asked. And yet, the house remains. Not in form, but in weight. The soil where it stood is still soft. Deer avoid it. Locals, when asked, say there's nothing there now, just trees. But hunters have reported strange echoes in the clearing, as if sound folds differently in that space. A boy once claimed to see footprints in the frost, not recent, not clear, just the shape of movement long gone, circling the space where a door once opened inward. According to a final memo filed in 2002, a retired caseworker visited the site one last time. She brought no tools, left no markers, only stood in the ruin until dusk, then turned to leave. She later described the sensation not as grief, but displacement. As if the house had not decayed, but simply stepped backward, into some corner of time where the system still doesn't look.